that denied admission to African Americans because of their race had to establish at least one land-grant institution for them. This act came about at the same time as the Plessy versus Ferguson case was gaining traction. This was a problematic case that found constitutional justification for segregation by declaring that white and Black Americans were to lead, quote, separate but equal lives. Many of those schools still exist today as America's respected historically Black colleges and universities. But thanks to Brown versus the Board of Education, Black students are legally allowed to attend any school they choose. However, many barriers still exist for Black Americans in higher education today. And before we examine them, we have to examine how the U.S. had tried to bridge the racial education gap that still exists. The U.S. government has worked to address the history of discrimination in higher education, most famously through affirmative action. This came out of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s in order to remove barriers keeping women and minorities out of higher education. It allows race to be considered only as a factor in admissions and bans schools from using racial quotas as part of their admissions process. In 2014, the Pew Research Center found that the majority of Americans support these measures, such proponents arguing that policies fight longstanding discrimination, ensure minorities have fair access to higher education, and that they counter legacy admissions policies. Its opponents, though, decry it for creating so-called reverse discrimination against white and Asian students. In the most recent of several court cases regarding this issue, a group of Asian American students brought a case against Harvard, arguing that the school had favored Black and Hispanic applicants rather than more qualified Asian students to fill racial quotas for their school. In their 2019 article covering the case, the New York Times reported that the federal judge presiding over it rejected this argument, saying that the university did meet constitutional standards for considering race in its admissions process. This ruling, like many others before it, continues to strengthen the case for affirmative action. Thanks to measures like affirmative action, Black students now have more access to higher education than ever before. The National Center for Education Statistics reported this year that 2.18 million African Americans were enrolled in post-secondary studies as of fall of 2017. Although access to higher education is improving for Black students, we still have a long way to go before we achieve true racial equality in higher education, particularly at the nation's top universities. The Brookings Institute found that the share of Black students at elite universities and the likelihood of a Black student attending those colleges have remained unchanged since 1980. In 2018, the New York Times reported that Black students make up 15% of college-age Americans, but just 6% of freshmen at elite schools, while 9% of white students and 26% of Asian students attend those top schools. Such disparities exist at all levels of education for African Americans, though, not just at the nation's most selective schools. The Education Trust, a nonprofit that studies gaps in educational opportunities for students of color, reports that 14% of Black adults nationally have attained a bachelor's degree, as compared with 23.7% of white adults. They also report that this sets Black adults behind beyond college, as it is estimated that currently about 65% of American jobs require a college education, and people with higher education earn higher wages and are less likely to be unemployed. As you can see, although strides have been made toward achieving racial equality in education, the persistent systemic racism in higher education continues to leave Black students at a disadvantage. Even with widely supported measures like affirmative action intended to make amends for the history of segregation in education, it is evident that African Americans still trail behind white Americans in enrollment in top universities and degree attainment, which can set them behind later in their professional lives. And although we are moving towards a more equitable system, systemic racism still persists in higher education today.
Kill the Indian in him and save the man. These hair-raising words come from the late Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of one of the first Native American boarding schools in the United States. This kill the Indian mindset not only carried the negative perception of Native Americans for years to come, but also implied that one was not a man if in fact he was Native American. This perception created a false sense of justification for non-natives that they felt they needed to whitewash entire Native communities and wipe away their culture and lifestyle completely. Thankfully, it didn't work, and society as a whole is making steps in the right direction to combat this deep-seated racism towards Indigenous people. For over a century, the U.S. government allowed and encouraged the forced removal of Native American children from their homes and families to be put into foster care and boarding schools. The Atlantic magazine paints a picture of these Native American boarding schools, saying, quote, Students were stripped of all things associated with Native life. Their long hair, a source of pride for many Native people, was cut short, usually into identical bowl haircuts. They exchanged traditional clothing for uniforms and embarked on a life influenced by strict military-style regimentation. Students were physically punished for speaking their native languages. Contact with family and community members was discouraged or sometimes forbidden altogether. Survivors have described a culture of pervasive physical and sexual abuse in these schools. Food and medical attention were often scarce, and many students died. Their parents sometimes learned of their death only after they had been buried in school cemeteries, some of which were unmarked." End quote. For most of us, that sounds unfathomable, but for many Americans, this was the reality that we can still feel the effects of today in our education system. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed by Congress in 1978, only 5 years after the closing of the last Native boarding school in America in 1973, to address the wrongdoings of such practices. Despite the new legislation, the state of Maine, along with many other parts of the country, continued to forcefully remove Native children from their homes and place them in foster care. In 1999, a federal review describes Maine as severely non-compliant, with Native children continuing to be removed from their homes at a much higher rate than white children. As of 2015, 8,000 of the 1.3 million people living in the state of Maine were Natives, making up the Wabanaki Confederation, consisting of the Passamaquoddy, Micmac, Maliseet, Abenaki, and Penobscot tribes. The University of Maine campus, in fact, sits on an island in the middle of the Penobscot River, on the ancestral territory of the Penobscot Nation. That being said, one would think that the university has a high number of Indigenous students, considering the close proximity, but quite the contrary is true. According to collegesimply.com, only about 1% of the student population here is of Native descent, as opposed to the 82% white population. In fact, in the state of Maine as a whole, only 16.8% of Indigenous people have a bachelor's degree or higher as of 2019, according to towncharts.com. This begs the question of why. Why and how are Natives still feeling the effects of these boarding school and government legislation allowing unfair treatment? According to nativehope.org, across the U.S. as a whole, roughly 65% of Native American children will graduate from high school. Additionally, only about 9.3% of Native students will earn a college degree. In the U.S., Natives have the highest dropout rate of any other ethnic group in the country, between 29 and 36%. A lot of this is cause of systemic racism and due to the lack of funding in Native communities. Many Native families are falling well below the poverty line, forcing parents to focus their efforts on food and shelter for their families, as opposed to the education help their children might need. Native Hope continues on saying, quote, "This failure is a direct result of the derogatory attitude held by some Americans toward the Native population and communities. Most people in the U.S. held negative stereotypes of Natives, labeling them alcoholics, lazy, and much more. These stereotypes have followed children into the classroom, causing low self-esteem and a disconnect from the curriculum, one that doesn't recognize a true history of Indigenous Americans, but a one-sided colonial account." End quote. The American education system, in my opinion, is one of the biggest examples of the continuing racism towards Natives. This long and brutal history of whitewashing Native American culture and forcing them into boarding schools, as well as poor legislation to help their communities, has had long-lasting effects of mistreatment toward the Native community still today.
Systemic racism can be found in almost any society, especially today. It affects a major population of Americans. This long history of racism is something that we can learn from as a society. And one of the things that's very, very important is that just because you yourself hasn't experienced this doesn't mean it isn't happening. It just means that you don't necessarily have that perspective. So something that is better off, especially in the education system, is to do your own research. Look up the statistics, look up the testimonies, look up the school district, look up how the allocating of resources is going to these public school systems. We could also elect people in certain power to help change these laws, and this is a way that people can be more educated, because that's the only way you can fight systemic racism is through knowledge and empathy and to be able to see someone else's perspective.